Welcome. Today, we begin a business story like no other, one of ambition, invention, and quiet betrayal. It starts in a Harvard dorm room and ends with billions, lawsuits, and a friendship left behind. This is the story of Facebook, and why you should never trust your friends in business. It is the fall semester of 2003, and you are in Kirkland House, one of Harvard University's 12 residential dormitories. The air outside is cool and wet, with the scent of leaves beginning to turn. Somewhere in the distance, the Charles River flows in its quiet rhythm, unnoticed. In this room, a young man sits, leaning forward slightly over his keyboard. His name is Mark Zuckerberg. At 19, Mark is in his second year of study, majoring in computer science and psychology. He is not particularly known on campus, not an athlete, nor a class politician, but those who do know him speak of his intellect with a kind of grudging admiration. He has the quiet, dry humor of someone who isn't trying to impress you. He is difficult to read, even for friends. Mark grew up in Dobbs Ferry, New York, in a household filled with computers, books, and quiet encouragement. His father, a dentist, introduced him to early programming. By high school, Mark was already building games and messaging tools. He wasn't just consuming the internet, he was shaping it. At Harvard, he carried that energy with him. He developed a reputation among classmates and housemates as someone who could code anything quickly, cleverly, without fanfare. But reputation only went so far. And like many students at elite universities, Mark felt the unspoken pressure of expectation, of doing something big. Not just earning a degree, but creating something lasting. In the fall of 2003, that pressure found an outlet. One weekend evening, long after most students had gone to sleep or stumbled home from parties, Mark sat in front of his screen, his fingers poised over the keys. He had an idea, not a new idea, but one with a slightly mischievous twist. He had spent some time browsing the various house directories, public photo listings provided by Harvard's different dorms. They included names, dorm rooms, and profile pictures. Most of them were static, rarely visited pages, but Mark realized that if he could scrape those images and names from the dorm websites, he could feed them into a new program, one that allowed users to compare to students' faces side by side and vote on who was more attractive. He called it FACEMAS. It wasn't sophisticated in purpose, but it was built with clever code. Mark hacked into several campus directories to gather the photos, not for malicious reasons, but for efficiency. He pulled image files, tagged them, and created a database of student profiles. By the early hours of the morning, the site was live, and in those quiet pre-dawn hours, word began to spread. Harvard students began clicking, voting, refreshing, laughing, criticizing. For some, it was funny. For others, offensive. But no one could deny how quickly it worked, or how widely it spread. FaceMash went viral within the Harvard network by morning. The site had been shut down. Administrators were not amused. Students raised concerns. Accusations of privacy violations began to circulate. Mark was called before Harvard's administrative board for an inquiry, though he wasn't formally punished. The message was clear. Cleverness alone was not a shield. But the reaction to FaceMash had planted a seed. It wasn't the ranking that interested Mark most. It was the response to identity, to digital self-representation, to the hunger people had to see and be seen online. Especially in a closed environment like a university. That was something here, not in FaceMash itself, but in the infrastructure it hinted at. Over the next few months, that idea would begin to take shape. At Harvard, each student had a Facebook, a printed or digital directory provided by the university, listing names, photos, and some personal details of incoming freshmen or residents of a particular house. But they were incomplete, scattered, and difficult to update. Most students didn't use them often, yet everyone remembered them. What if there was one centralized, online version? A living profile with a photo, interests, friends, and more. A place not only to see others, but to express yourself, to say in quiet digital language, "This is who I am, and here are the people I know." Mark began building, but he wouldn't build it alone. Around this time, another name joins the story. A different kind of student. Eduardo Saverin. Eduardo was also a Harvard sophomore, but his world looked different. He studied economics, wore button-down shirts, and moved with quiet confidence. His family was wealthy, and he had already made a name for himself on campus as an investor, using statistical models to profit from oil futures during a volatile period in the market. Eduardo and Mark weren't best friends, but they were friendly. They had met through mutual acquaintances and shared meals now and then. Mark was not especially social, but with Eduardo there was a calm, respectful connection. They spoke occasionally about ideas, and now Mark had one to share. In early 2004, Mark told Eduardo about a project he wanted to launch, a kind of online social directory for Harvard students. Simple profiles, clean layout, school email verification, no advertising yet. Just users. Mark needed someone to help cover initial server costs and offer basic business advice. Eduardo agreed. He pledged $1,000 to get the site live, with more to follow as needed. In return, Mark gave him a co-founder title, the role of Chief Financial Officer, and a significant ownership stake, approximately 30% of the company they would soon incorporate. The arrangement was informal, but real. Two friends, working quietly on something that didn't yet seem destined for greatness. They began to call it the Facebook. The site was coded over several long nights. Mark worked from his dorm room, headphones on, screen glowing, writing line after line. The database, schema, login structure, image uploading, all designed from scratch. There were no managers, no advisors, no legal teams. Just Mark at the keyboard, Eduardo on spreadsheets, and a few trusted roommates offering feedback. By early February 2004, the site was ready. They chose a launch date, February 4th, 2004, and with the push of a key, the Facebook.com went live. It is the morning of February 4th, 2004. A late winter chill clings to the campus. The sky is a uniform gray, soft and unmoving, the kind that turns the world inward. But in the dormitories of Harvard, a quiet ripple has begun to move through the student body, not loud or explosive, but a flicker of interest passed between friends. Did you see this new thing? It's called the Facebook. It's only for Harvard students. There had been no announcement, no posters, no school-wide email, just a few invitations sent by Mark Zuckerberg and Eduardo Saverin to fellow students, and a bare-bones launch. And yet, within 24 hours, over 1,000 students had signed up. The site was elegant in its simplicity. To join, a student needed a harvard.edu email address. Once inside, they could upload a photo, list their concentration, their classes, their house affiliation. Most importantly, they could search for other students and add them as friends. It wasn't just about seeing names. It was about mapping social relationships, the invisible threads between classmates, roommates, lab partners, dining hall acquaintances. That map quickly became addictive. Technically, the site was modest by modern standards. It ran on PHP with a MySQL database. The design was clean, minimalist, no unnecessary ornamentation. Just blue and white text, crisp lines, and an almost academic restraint. Mark had even inserted a quote into the footer of every page. A Mark Zuckerberg production. It was part joke, part assertion, a reminder of who had built the thing. Line by line, night after night, in a quiet room in Kirkland House. Mark handled all the technical operations, server configuration, database, scaling, UI tweaks. It was all under his control. The early servers were hosted using Eduardo's $1,000 investment, enough to support the initial rush of users, but only just. Eduardo, for his part, was delighted. He took on the business role with genuine interest. He began to explore advertising models, drafting early pitch emails to small companies that might be interested in targeting college students, local restaurants, textbook sellers, student services. He also drafted a business plan, one of the earliest attempts to define what the Facebook was and what it could become. Eduardo's approach was traditional. Focus on measured growth, bring in small revenue through targeted ads, and, perhaps, someday, expand to other universities. It was a reasonable vision, but it was also, quietly, smaller than the one Mark was beginning to imagine. Still, in those early weeks, the project was cooperative, friendly. Mark and Eduardo met regularly to discuss progress. They answered user feedback, addressed bugs, and talked about expanding the server capacity as more students poured in. There was even some light press coverage. The Harvard Crimson, the university's student newspaper, took interest in the Facebook's sudden popularity. Mark gave a short interview, downplaying the attention but expressing quiet satisfaction with how quickly it had grown. But not everyone was pleased. Elsewhere on campus, 3 students, Cameron Winklevoss, Tyler Winklevoss, and Divya Narendra, were also watching. Months earlier, the 3 had been working on a different site, a Harvard-exclusive social network called Harvard Connection, which would later be rebranded as ConnectU. In November 2003, they had contacted Mark Zuckerberg, asking for his help as a programmer. They shared their idea, gave him access to certain files, and trusted him to help them build the site. Mark had agreed, but as the weeks went on, communication slowed. He sent few updates. Delays were frequent. Then, in early February, just as Harvard Connection was nearing what they thought was a prototype stage, the Facebook launched to the trio. It felt like betrayal. They believed Mark had taken their idea, or at least the core concept, and launched his own version before theirs could reach the public. Their project, they felt, had been used as a springboard. The details of what Mark saw in their code, what he borrowed, and what he ignored would become the subject of deep legal scrutiny. But for now, their response was private, immediate, and bitter. They began drafting a complaint to the Harvard administration, accusing Mark of intellectual theft and bad faith. Mark, for his part, dismissed the accusations as unfounded. Ideas are not property, he believed. He had written every line of the Facebook himself. The idea of an online social directory wasn't unique. He had simply built it first and built it better. Still, the incident planted a seed of conflict that would slowly grow. Meanwhile, the Facebook's growth was undeniable. By March 2004, just 1 month after launch, the platform had spread beyond Harvard. Students at Yale, Columbia, and Stanford were now requesting access. Mark modified the registration system to include new university domains. Each expansion brought a new wave of users, and with each wave, the social map grew more complex, more layered. The user base doubled, then doubled again. Mark added small features, relationship status, favorite movies and books, and profile pictures that could be enlarged when clicked. These little details made the experience feel personal, lived in, like a digital version of campus life itself. Behind it all, the server strain increased, traffic surged, emails flowed. The site was no longer a side project. It was becoming a full-time job. Eduardo, though still focused on business, had also taken a summer internship with Lehman Brothers in New York. It was a prestigious opportunity, something most students would be proud of. But it also meant physical distance. And in the world of fast-moving startups, distance begins to matter. Mark stayed in Cambridge, close to the servers, close to the product. He was surrounded by fellow coders, including Dustin Moskovitz, his roommate and newly joined partner. Dustin took on more and more technical responsibilities, coding alongside Mark and discussing architecture. Late into the night, the team dynamic was shifting, and though no one said it out loud, the center of gravity was beginning to tilt away from Eduardo. The spring semester of 2004 slowly gives way to the warmth of May on Harvard's campus. Cherry blossoms have fallen, scattering across walkways like pale confetti. Students finish their exams and begin to pack. The atmosphere is one of release, relief, nostalgia, possibility, but for Mark Zuckerberg, there is no pause, no summer vacation. By now, the Facebook is no longer just a Harvard curiosity. It has expanded into over a dozen universities, each with thousands of active users. The servers are working constantly. New requests pour in daily from students, from schools, even from a few small investors. Something is happening, and Mark can feel it. Harvard is no longer the right place to build it, and so he makes a decision. Instead of returning home or staying on campus for the summer, Mark will move to California, specifically to Palo Alto, in the heart of Silicon Valley. It is not a formal relocation. There are no meetings with venture capitalists yet, no rented office buildings. What he secures instead is a small rental house, unassuming from the outside, with just enough space for a few desks, sleeping bags, and laptops. The address is simple, the neighborhood is quiet, but within its walls, the company will take on a new shape. He is not going alone. With him travels Dustin Moskovitz, his dependable roommate and friend, now fully committed to the technical development of the platform. Dustin's presence is calm, unobtrusive, but absolutely essential. Where Mark charges ahead, Dustin stabilizes. They are soon joined by a small group of friends and collaborators, coders, designers, even one who will act as a kind of cook and caretaker for the makeshift startup house. There is no schedule. They work at odd hours, sleep on couches, eat from takeout containers, and share a single goal: to keep the Facebook running, growing and evolving. Back in New York, however, Eduardo Savarin is living a different summer. He has taken an internship at Lehman Brothers, one of the largest investment banks in the country. The internship is prestigious, competitive, the sort of thing that might lead to a career on Wall Street. He wears a suit each day, attends meetings, studies markets, and in the evenings, he tries to stay involved in the business he helped start. Eduardo remains CFO and co-founder. On paper, his role has not changed. He still owns over 30% of the company. He still fields business emails, offers feedback, and tries from a distance to manage advertising strategy. But increasingly, his emails go unanswered. When he sends ideas, they are acknowledged briefly, if at all. When he asks for updates, the replies come days late. Sometimes not at all. There is no fight, no harsh words, just a slow, spreading silence. The culture in Palo Alto is entirely different from the formal, structured world Eduardo now inhabits. In the California house, the lines between work and life have disappeared. They code at all hours. They test new features on the fly. There is no dress code, no hierarchy, and most importantly, no clear business oversight. This is where a new figure enters the story. Someone who will influence everything that follows, Sean Parker. You may know him as the co-founder of Napster, the peer-to-peer file-sharing platform that upended the music industry in the early 2000s. Sean was charismatic, notoriously ambitious, and well-connected in Silicon Valley. He was also only 24 years old. Sean first learned about the Facebook through a girlfriend who attended Stanford. He saw the site on her laptop and immediately recognized something rare, a social platform that was simple, elegant, and most importantly, addictive. He arranged to meet Mark. It was a casual meeting, but for Mark, it left a mark. Sean told him, what few others had, that this wasn't just a neat tool for college students. It was the future of social identity online. He spoke about vision, about scale, about turning the Facebook from a student startup into a real company, something that could expand globally, become a platform for identity, media, and eventually revenue far beyond college campuses. He understood not just the product, but the possibilities. And Mark listened. At first, Sean had no official role. He was simply an advisor, a voice in Mark's ear, offering guidance, connections, strategy. But his presence changed things. He questioned why the company wasn't seeking outside investment, why it hadn't already hired a full-time legal team, why it was still being partly run, in theory, by a college sophomore in New York who wasn't even present. From Sean's perspective, Eduardo was dead weight. He was not in California. He wasn't part of the new team, and he didn't understand the scale of what was possible. Mark never said this outright, but his actions began to reflect that belief. Back in New York, Eduardo was increasingly isolated. His summer internship was demanding, but he still tried to carve out time for the company. He flew to Palo Alto once for a brief visit and found himself out of step with the others. The house was loose, chaotic, foreign. He wore a collared shirt. The others wore pajamas. He asked about advertising revenue. They rolled their eyes. Still, he wanted to contribute. He returned to New York and, on his own initiative, opened a bank account for the company and signed a series of business contracts, hoping to formalize things and raise additional funding, but, in doing so, he made a critical misstep. He froze the company's spending temporarily, an effort to impose order, to ensure proper tracking of expenses. Mark, hearing this, was livid. To him, Eduardo's actions were not protective, they were obstructive. In Mark's mind, Eduardo had no authority to limit spending. He was not in Palo Alto. He didn't understand what was happening. This small act, a financial freeze, would become the tipping point. And from that moment, Mark would begin quietly preparing a different future. In July of 2004, under the dry California sun, something quiet but profoundly consequential took place. What had begun as a dorm room project was about to become an official company. Until now, the Facebook had existed in a kind of legal limbo. It had a domain name, a growing user base, and informal agreements between college students. There had been investments of time and money, yes, but very little paperwork. No formal cap table, no structured shares, no bylaws. That was about to change. With advice from Sean Parker and pressure from the Silicon Valley culture surrounding him, Mark decided to incorporate the company properly, but not in Massachusetts, where Harvard is located. Instead, they chose Delaware, a state known for its favorable corporate laws, particularly for technology startups. The process was simple, at least on paper. Form a new company, structure ownership through stock, and define roles formally. On July 29, 2004, a new entity was born, the Facebook Inc. It was no longer a college side project. It was now a Delaware C corporation, ready to accept investment and scale in a way that dorm room projects cannot. Now, the details of incorporation in this case are not just technicalities. They are where the shape of the betrayal first becomes visible. Here's how it unfolded. Mark, as founder and CEO, held the majority of voting control. This was not unusual. He had coded the site, expanded its reach, and assembled the team that now surrounded him in Palo Alto. Dustin Moskovitz, as an early technical contributor and trusted roommate, was granted a meaningful slice of equity as well. Sean Parker, though still unofficial at this point, began whispering the logic of venture capital, investor rounds, and clean cap tables. The real question was what to do about Eduardo. He still held, on paper, about 34% of the company, a figure based on his early $19,000 contribution, made in good faith when there were no employees, no legal team, and no roadmap beyond Harvard. But Eduardo had not moved to Palo Alto. He had not written code. He was not in the house. He was still working on Wall Street, commuting each day in a suit, attending business lunches, and trying to act like a responsible CFO. To Mark and Sean, this distance mattered. In their minds, Eduardo's involvement had become abstract, a figure on paper, not a force on the ground. But the equity he held, that was very real. So they began, quietly, to prepare a solution. In the official documents filed in Delaware, Eduardo was listed as a co-founder and still had a sizable stake. But the new stock structure was designed with flexibility. Mark created a new class of shares with special voting power. This gave him more control, the ability to outvote other shareholders on major decisions, even if his percentage of ownership wasn't the majority. It was subtle, quiet, entirely legal. Mark also reserved the right to issue more shares to new employees or investors, effectively diluting the percentage held by others, including Eduardo. And so, over the course of the next few months, this structure was used exactly for that purpose. They issued additional shares to themselves and others. They carefully excluded Eduardo from certain internal communications. They opened a new bank account, one that Eduardo could not access, and all the while, Eduardo remained unaware. Still, from New York, he tried to stay engaged. He reached out by email, asked about marketing plans, offered to travel west again. At one point, he sent over a contract with a potential ad deal, small but symbolically important. It was a way to demonstrate his value, but the contract was never signed. Emails went UNRETURNED. In Palo Alto. The energy of the company moved forward without him. Mark and his team were now working constantly. They were developing features like groups, tweaking the friend system, building out infrastructure to handle the rising flood of users. They had expanded to dozens of universities. They were now serving hundreds of thousands of students. Servers were being upgraded, a real office was being considered. Investors were starting to ask questions, and Mark, quiet, deliberate Mark, had begun to listen to advice from those who had built and lost and built again. Simplify your cap table. Be ruthless, early. Don't let legacy friends slow you down. Eduardo, of course, suspected none of this, at least not yet. He believed in what they were building. He had funded it when no one else had. He had trusted Mark with his money, with his name, with his confidence. There had been no argument, no falling out, just a long, slow erosion of inclusion, a subtle narrowing of the circle until he was no longer inside it. But legally, Eduardo was still a large shareholder. He still had power, at least on paper, so, to change that, a final maneuver would be necessary, and it would come soon, by the end of 2004. The Facebook was no longer a curiosity, it was a phenomenon. What had begun at Harvard had now reached nearly every major university in the United States. Students at Berkeley, Duke, NYU, Michigan, and dozens of others were signing up in waves. Every new .edu domain added to the database meant thousands of fresh accounts. Each new user updated their profile, uploaded a photo, and began building their network, quietly, compulsively, often without realizing just how deeply the platform was weaving itself into their daily lives. For many students, checking Facebook became part of their routine. Morning coffee, a glance at friends' statuses, a look at who had posted, who had changed relationship status, who had added whom, and behind it all, Mark Zuckerberg was watching the growth curve, always. He saw the graphs bend upward, the servers stretch under the weight, the features multiply. He knew this was only the beginning, but he also knew that to truly scale, to go from a student phenomenon to a global platform, the company needed money, real money, and for that, it needed investors. The man who would bring that first money in was Peter Thiel. Thiel was already a prominent figure in Silicon Valley. He had co-founded PayPal, sold it to eBay for hundreds of millions, and begun investing in earlier stage technology companies through his fund, Clarion Capital. He was known for being methodical, philosophical, and unusually attuned to the future of digital identity. In August of 2004, Thiel met with Mark, likely through the introduction of Sean Parker, who had become increasingly central to the company's strategy. The meeting was brief but impactful. Thiel was impressed with Mark's vision, the quiet conviction, the resistance to advertising too early, the insistence on technical control. More than anything, he was impressed by the engagement metrics. Users weren't just signing up, they were staying. After some negotiation, Thiel agreed to invest $500,000 in seed funding in exchange for a 10.2% stake in the company. This was a pivotal moment. Facebook now had capital, and just as importantly, it had validation from one of the Valley's most respected investors. But this investment came with strings. Thiel and others wanted a clean structure. They wanted clarity around ownership, voting control, and the team's cohesion, and they were wary of any early founders who seemed inactive or disconnected. Which brings us, again, to Eduardo Saverin. At this point, Eduardo was still a shareholder. On paper, he held roughly 24 to 30%, depending on how the previous incorporations and reissues had been recorded. But his role as CFO had faded. He was no longer on the ground. He had missed major team decisions, and the incident earlier that summer, when he froze Facebook's bank account out of caution, had caused a sharp break in trust. Mark and Sean, aligned in vision and tactics, began to take concrete steps. In the fall of 2004, new shares were authorized by the company's board of directors. These shares were issued selectively to Mark, Dustin, and a small number of key employees. Eduardo received none of them. This is a maneuver known in corporate law as dilution. It does not remove ownership, but it changes the proportions, shrinking one shareholder's piece of the pie without requiring their consent. The new shares were structured such that Eduardo's ownership was reduced from approximately 24% to less than 10%, in some estimates as low as 0.03% of voting shares. To achieve this, Mark used his role as CEO and his controlling voting rights to approve the plan, executing it under the guidance of attorneys and advisors. Legally, it was sound. Ethically, it was something else entirely. It is important to note that Eduardo had signed documents earlier that year, likely without realizing their implications, that enabled this plan to proceed. In April 2004, he had signed a restructured shareholder agreement, believing it to be part of the process of formalizing their roles, particularly as the company incorporated and prepared for funding. He had not been told, not clearly, not transparently, that the agreement enabled others to issue new shares without requiring unanimous board approval. There was no open conflict, no call, no face-to-face explanation, just a quiet shift of numbers on paper and an email that never came. Back in New York, Eduardo was still representing himself as a co-founder. He gave interviews. He reached out to potential advertisers. He told family and friends about the company he had helped build. He had no idea that the majority of his ownership had been erased, and no one, not Mark, not Sean, not anyone on the Facebook team, told him. The betrayal was not a moment, it was a process. Then, in the spring of 2005, Eduardo traveled to Palo Alto again. He had sensed distance. He wanted clarity. He still believed in the product, still wanted to help. But when he arrived at the office, now a real office, not just a rented house, something was different. He was treated like an outsider. Conversations quieted when he entered. Eyes shifted, polite smiles, but no warmth. At some point during that visit, Eduardo learned the truth. He was no longer a decision maker, no longer a major owner. His shares had been diluted to near nothing, and he had been removed from the board. He was still a co-founder, yes, but only in name. The betrayal had been completed, without a single raised voice. What followed would be a lawsuit, one of the most significant in the company's history. But we are not there just yet. For now, Eduardo walked out of that office alone. The friend he had trusted, the company he had funded, and the title he had carried, all of it had been hollowed out in silence. And Facebook kept growing. The Palo Alto office sits just off a quiet street. It isn't flashy, not yet. There are no Facebook banners on the windows, no glass conference rooms or private chefs. The company is still small enough to hide in plain sight. A handful of desks, whiteboards covered in flowcharts, long cables tangled near overworked servers. In the spring of 2005, Facebook is still not profitable, still limited to college students, but it is clear to anyone paying attention that something is happening. The user base has passed 1 million. Every new school added brings tens of thousands of new accounts. Growth is no longer just fast, it is exponential. Inside the office, Mark Zuckerberg has settled into the rhythm of leadership. His hair is longer now. His wardrobe, the same grey t-shirts and hoodies. His voice remains quiet, but his influence is absolute. He works constantly, focuses on product, builds new features, talks to investors, writes code. He rarely talks about Eduardo Saverin, and when he does, the tone is even dispassionate. Legal. Eduardo, meanwhile, has returned to New York. But he is no longer simply an intern. He is no longer smiling in interviews, speaking with pride about the company he helped start. That version of Eduardo, the early believer, is gone. What remains is a young man in disbelief, with documents in his hand and questions no one will answer. He begins to consult lawyers, and those lawyers begin to examine the paper trail, the April shareholder agreement, the dilution filings, the emails that were never sent, and they see something unusual, not criminal, but intentional. They see how the dilution occurred, the timing, the silence, the way new shares were issued to everyone but Eduardo. They see that this was not a misunderstanding, it was a decision. And so, in the summer of 2005, Eduardo takes a formal step. He files a lawsuit against Facebook, Inc. The suit is filed in Santa Clara County Superior Court in California. It alleges breach of fiduciary duty, breach of contract, and misrepresentation. He is not seeking to destroy the company. He is not trying to halt its progress. He simply wants what he believes he is owed: recognition, compensation, and a seat at the table he helped build. Inside Facebook, the lawsuit is treated clinically. There is no panic, no shouting, only lawyers, phone calls, briefings. By now, the company is preparing for its next stage of funding, and Mark is working closely with a growing team of executives and advisors. Sean Parker is still involved, though his role is already beginning to shift. The company has outgrown the house in Palo Alto. They are preparing for Series A funding, real money from real firms. The mood is professional, focused, but for Mark, there is a tension beneath the surface. Eduardo is not a stranger. He is not a competitor or a former investor. He was, at one point, the closest person to this company's origin, its first funder, its business lead, its co-founder. Now he is a plaintiff, and the case is public, in court filings. Eduardo's team includes emails from Mark, early exchanges, showing collaboration, shared vision, and verbal confirmation of partnership. There are references to ownership, percentages, expectations, and the pivotal investment that kept the site online during its fragile first weeks. Mark's lawyers respond with precision. They argue that Eduardo was not actively involved, that his freezing of Facebook's bank account, however brief, endangered the company, that he did not keep pace with the growth, that the share structure was amended in accordance with the agreements he signed. In short, they claim that nothing illegal was done, and perhaps, in the strictest legal sense, that is true. But the spirit of the partnership, the handshake agreement, the friendly trust between two college students, that had clearly been shattered as the case proceeds. Mark continues to build. The company adds new features. The photo feature goes live. Friend groups expand. Schools across Canada and the United Kingdom are added. For the first time, the idea of Facebook as a global platform becomes real. But something else begins to shift. The tone, the language. Where once Facebook was described in casual terms, a college social site, a fun way to connect, it now enters the world of corporate identity, branding, platform strategy, user engagement metrics. Mark is no longer a coder in a hoodie. He is now a CEO. His time is managed by assistants. His comments are vetted by communications staff. His posture changes. He speaks with less hesitation. and Eduardo is no longer mentioned at all. The lawsuit would last more than a year. It never goes to trial. Instead, behind closed doors, a settlement is reached. Eduardo is offered an undisclosed sum of money, as well as a reaffirmation of his status as co-founder. It is a quiet victory, not the public restoration he may have hoped for, but a recognition nonetheless. His name will appear on the masthead, his story will be acknowledged in history, but his stake is gone. He will never have a seat at the boardroom table. He will never again be part of the company's strategy or future, and the friend he once trusted, the boy in the dorm room who asked for $1,000 to rent a server, is now a corporate leader preparing to change the world. For Mark, the matter is now resolved. For Eduardo, it is never unfelt. The friendship is not repaired. The phone calls never resume. There is no reunion. Just two paths, now utterly separate, and a company that keeps growing. By late 2005, the Facebook had begun to outgrow the meaning of its own name. The original concept, a digital yearbook for elite colleges, had evolved. What began as a list of names and faces was now an expanding web of relationships, groups, photos, messages, and shared memories. The site was no longer confined to students. It was becoming a platform, slowly, steadily, and with clear intent. And, with every step forward, the company grew farther away from its earliest shape. The lawsuit with Eduardo had been settled. Quietly, no press conference, no apology, just a signature, a sum, and a sealed agreement. He would be listed as a co-founder, and he would receive shares in the company, though reduced, and with no voting power. The financial terms were confidential, but reported estimates later placed the settlement value in the range of hundreds of millions of dollars, especially once Facebook's valuation soared in the years to come. But within the company, Eduardo was never mentioned again. His emails had long been disconnected. His desk, which had never truly existed in the California offices, remained empty. The friendship, which had once been quiet and useful, had ended not with an argument, but with a sequence of filings, and in his place, a new generation of executives began to gather. Mark Zuckerberg, at just 21 years old, was now operating in a different world. He had attracted the attention of venture capitalists, including Axel Partners, who invested $12.7 million in Facebook in May 2005, leading the company's Series A funding round. With that investment came growth. The staff increased, offices expanded, salaries were paid, benefits were offered. The company hired engineers, designers, business strategists, each carefully selected to share Mark's vision: growth first, profit later, build fast, refine later. The mantra was not yet move fast and break things, but the energy was similar. Mark was still the final decision maker, still CEO, still deeply involved in product development. He had not handed off the core engineering work, not yet. He continued to read every line of product feedback, comment on interface changes, and personally weigh in on new features. But the company had begun its march toward professionalism, and with that, the past was streamlined, the narrative simplified. It became easier, cleaner, to speak of Facebook as a new kind of company, with no mention of the awkward early days, no mention of Eduardo's checks, no dorm rooms, no bank account freezes, just progress. Just users. By mid-2006, Facebook reached a milestone that quietly altered its identity forever. For the first time, it became available to anyone, not just students. No more .edu email requirement, no more gates. The walls that had once defined the site, college enrollment, exclusivity, the Ivy League cachet, were taken down. Anyone with an email address could now create a profile, build a network, and enter the world that had once been reserved for a few. This move was controversial inside the company. Some early users, especially students, feared that Facebook would lose its charm, its purity, that opening the gates would lead to spam, to older users, to a messier, less personal experience. But Mark was unmoved to him. Facebook's purpose was not to remain a campus tool. It was to become the social infrastructure of the internet, to map connections, to organize relationships, to define identity, and that couldn't happen within a walled garden. This was the era of transformation. The site's features multiplied. You could now upload unlimited photos, tag friends in those images, write status updates, message users directly, and join interest groups. The interface, still blue and white, was increasingly polished, and the user base grew into the tens of millions. There were still no ads in the traditional sense, but the data, the immense river of personal information flowing through the platform, was being catalogued, organized, measured. Everything was tracked. What you liked, who you knew, where you logged in, how long you stayed. And this was by design. Because Mark didn't just want to build a social site. He wanted to build a system of digital identity, one that was more accurate, more interconnected, and more persistent than anything the internet had seen before. And still, nowhere in this new world was there room for Eduardo Savin. There were no photos of him in the new offices, no quotes in interviews, no public recognition beyond the fine print of a settlement. The silence was not angry. It was absolute. He had become, in a way, the ghost of Facebook's past, a reminder of its roots, and of what had been left behind in the name of growth. For the staff that joined during these years, fresh hires, many of them in their 20s, there was little knowledge of the origin story. They knew Mark as the founder. They knew the site was growing. They knew the culture. Move quickly, think globally, test constantly, don't look back. The past was something to optimize, not preserve. So the early betrayal, the quiet cutting away of a friend, a co-founder, a partner, faded, not denied, not hidden, just forgotten. It is September 2006. Facebook, now 2 years old, is no longer a novelty. It is a habit, across dorm rooms, cafes, office cubicles, and bedrooms. People are logging in, not once a day, but many times, refreshing their profiles, checking messages, looking to see who has added whom, who changed their relationship status, who posted photos from the weekend. But until now, all of this required effort. You had to go to your friends' pages, one by one. There was no central stream, no way to see everything in one place. That was about to change, and it would spark the first real rebellion inside Facebook's user community. The idea had been discussed internally for months. What if users didn't have to look for updates? What if the platform brought the updates to them automatically? Mark Zuckerberg and the product team saw the potential. They imagined a dynamic, scrolling stream of real-time activity. A single place to see everything. Status, changes, new, friendships, uploaded photos, wall posts. They called it Newsfeed. From a technical standpoint, it was an ambitious feature. It required reworking the back-end structure, querying data efficiently, updating content constantly, rendering a unique, personalized stream for each user. From a business standpoint, it was revolutionary. Newsfeed would drastically increase engagement, the metric by which all digital platforms live or die. If users could passively consume updates, they would stay longer, click more, return more frequently. It was, in many ways, inevitable. But what no one at Facebook fully anticipated was the emotional reaction. On September 5, 2006, Newsfeed was launched. The change was immediate and visible. When users logged in, they were no longer greeted by their own profiles. Instead, they saw a real-time stream of everything their friends were doing. Every new photo, every status update, every comment, every connection. For many, the experience was jarring. It felt like surveillance. Moments that had once been scattered, quiet, semi-private updates were now pulled into full view. A breakup, previously marked by a subtle change of status, was now announced. A tagged photo appeared instantly in dozens of feeds. A casual comment became a public moment. The backlash was swift. Within hours, students created protest groups, ironically, on Facebook itself. One group, titled Students Against Facebook Newsfeed, gained over 280,000 members in just 2 days. It was one of the fastest growing groups in the site's history. Users flooded message boards and help desks. The language was sharp, often anxious. This is stalking. You didn't ask us. Facebook used to be safe. The platform that had once been about connection was now accused of exposing people, of prioritizing engagement over comfort, design over consent. Inside the company, the mood was tense. Engineers and designers had worked tirelessly to launch Newsfeed. They believed in the product. They believed it improved the platform. But now, they watched as thousands of users, loyal users, demanded its removal. Mark Zuckerberg responded in a way that revealed both his mindset and the company's evolving identity. Rather than apologizing for the idea itself, he apologized for the way it was introduced. He published a short statement on Facebook's blog.com, measured and telling, "We really messed this one up. We did a bad job of explaining what the new features were, and an even worse job of giving you control of them." He didn't roll the feature back. Instead, Facebook added privacy controls, a way to limit what was shown in the feed, or to whom, but Newsfeed stayed. The backlash eventually faded, and within months, it became the central interface of the platform. This moment, the arrival of Newsfeed, marked a turning point. It was no longer just about mapping social networks. It was now about designing attention. The platform wasn't merely showing you what you asked for, it was telling you what to look at. This shift would lay the groundwork for all that followed. Algorithmic sorting, content prioritization, emotional influence studies, and the careful tuning of digital behavior. And it reflected, in a subtle way, the same dynamic that had played out with Eduardo. A decision made at the top. A change justified by data. An outcry answered by tweaks, not reversals. A sense undeniable that trust was not the guiding principle. In retrospect, Newsfeed was a brilliant product. It dramatically increased the time users spent on Facebook. It provided a continuous stream of updates that created the illusion of connection, a kind of ambient intimacy that kept people scrolling. And for Facebook, it was the beginning of algorithmic control. From this point forward, users would no longer simply use Facebook. They would be shaped by it, nudged, directed, and filtered through systems they would never fully see. But beneath the surface, something else had changed. The relationship between Facebook and its users was no longer one of mutual novelty. It was now one of power. And power, once held, is rarely shared. It is May 2007, and the Facebook team is preparing for an event. But this is not a product launch in the traditional sense. There is no new feature, no interface redesign, no tool for users to upload or post. What they are preparing to release is access not to more users, but to developers. It's called the Facebook platform, and for the first time, Facebook is no longer just a product. It becomes an ecosystem. To understand the significance of this, we return briefly to the structure of Facebook as it stood in early 2007. The platform had exploded. Over 20 million users were now active on Facebook. The company had moved into a sleek new office space in downtown Palo Alto, staffed by engineers, designers, legal counsel, and a growing executive team. Mark Zuckerberg, now just 23 years old, had matured into a CEO who rarely left the product conversation, but now also appeared in suits for investor meetings. He still wore hoodies most days, but they were no longer thrifted. They were part of a look. And behind the scenes, he was planning something far larger than anyone expected. He wasn't interested in just growing the user base. He wanted to turn Facebook into the social layer of the internet, a platform upon which other companies, tools, and services could be built, not just one site, but a web within the web. The Facebook platform was announced on May 24, 2007, at an event at the company's headquarters. Developers were invited. Press attended. Mark took the stage in his usual, unassuming way, hands at his sides, voice quiet, never showy, and explained the vision. For the last 3 years, we've been building Facebook to be a platform that helps people connect and communicate more efficiently. And today, we're taking the next logical step. We're opening Facebook to everyone else. The room applauded, but what he meant was far more technical and more consequential than many realized at the time. Facebook was releasing an API, an application programming interface, that allowed third-party developers to build applications that could run inside Facebook's environment. Games, surveys, quizzes, productivity tools, social apps, anything a developer could imagine, as long as it followed the rules. For developers, this was an extraordinary opportunity. Facebook had a captive audience of tens of millions, growing every month. And now, any small team or independent coder could build a feature, game, or widget that would sit inside that vast social environment. Early adopters rushed in. Within weeks, hundreds of apps had appeared. I Like, a music sharing app, Causes, a tool for raising money and awareness for non-profits, Slide and Rock You, platforms for sharing photo slideshows, and of course, games, dozens of them. Some were silly, some were smart, many were wildly addictive, and almost overnight, user behavior began to change. Instead of simply updating their status or adding friends, users began interacting with apps. They played games against one another. They gave each other virtual gifts. They answered questions like, "Which movie character are you?" or "How well do you know me?" and posted results to their profile. Each of these actions, clicks, installs, shares, drove more engagement, more time on site, more data. And from Facebook's perspective, it was a triumph. User growth accelerated. Activity soared. Developers flocked to the platform, hoping to create the next viral app and ride it to fortune. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. Because in order for these apps to work, to be social, they needed access to user data, and not just basic info. The original Facebook platform API allowed apps, once installed, to collect your name, your profile picture, your network affiliation, your friend list, your birthday, location, likes, and interests. But it went further than that. If you installed an app, it could also request data from your friends' profiles. Even if those friends hadn't installed the app themselves, it was all presented with a simple pop-up. This app will access your information, but few read the fine print, and few understood what it meant. Because with each click, each quiz, each game, a vast stream of personal information was leaving the user's control and entering the hands of third-party developers. Not malicious actors, necessarily, but outsiders. And once data left Facebook's servers and entered the developers' hands, it was largely unregulated. There were rules, to be sure, terms of service, but no strong enforcement, no audits, and certainly no clear way for users to know what was taken, by whom, and where it went. For a while, it didn't matter. Users were having fun. Developers were building fast. Facebook was expanding. Mark was hailed in the press as a visionary, a digital architect opening the gates to a new kind of online experience. In September 2007, Facebook announced the formation of Facebook Ads, signaling their first steps toward monetizing the platform in a structured way. And yet again, there was no mention of the cost. Not in money, but in trust. Eduardo Sabarin, by this point, was entirely absent from the public narrative. When reporters asked about the company's founding, Mark offered a neutral timeline, no drama, no details. When asked directly about Eduardo, he rarely commented. The betrayal had become part of the company's DNA, an origin story rewritten through repetition, until it became convenient myth. And in some ways, it foreshadowed Facebook's broader strategy. Make decisions fast, control the narrative, apologize when necessary, but rarely undo. The Facebook platform would continue to grow. Some apps would make millions, others would harvest millions of records, some would vanish overnight, and the users, mostly unaware, would continue to click allow. It is the beginning of 2008. Outside, the tech world is changing. New companies rise, old ones shift. The economy is not yet in collapse, but shadows have begun to lengthen over Wall Street. Confidence remains high, but cautious. Inside Facebook, however, the atmosphere is charged with growth. The company has moved again, now occupying a much larger office in Palo Alto, outfitted with conference rooms, collaborative workspaces, and an increasing number of new hires. There are now over 500 employees. The platform supports tens of millions of users, spread across dozens of countries. What was once a college-only social network is now a global tool for connection. Mark Zuckerberg, still just 23 years old, moves through this space like a quiet center of gravity. He still wears hoodies. He still sits with engineers. He still reviews product but now, everything passes through layers: legal, design, growth, policy. The company is no longer improvising, it is strategizing, and with each decision, Facebook becomes less like the dorm room startup it once was, and more like the vast corporate empire it will soon become. One of the first major priorities of 2008 is international expansion. Facebook has dominated US college markets, but now its growth strategy turns outward to Europe, South America, and Asia. Localized versions of the site begin to appear. Facebook in German, French, and Spanish. Facebook for India, with local language options. Facebook in Brazil, where a rival site called Orkju had previously held dominance. Engineers and product managers work closely with linguists and regional advisors to ensure the experience feels native, not imposed. The goal is subtle, not just to be usable, but to become normal in every culture it touches. And it works. By the end of 2008, Facebook has over 100 million active users, but not everyone in Silicon Valley is cheering, because another company, leaner, louder, and wildly popular among tech insiders, has emerged as a serious competitor. That company is Twitter. It is younger than Facebook, launched publicly in 2006. At first, Twitter seems almost trivial, a platform where people post short, 140-character messages about what they're doing. There are no profiles in the traditional sense, no photo albums, no friend lists. But Twitter has something powerful: real-time public conversation. While Facebook is still largely private, Twitter is open. It spreads news. It accelerates movements. It is messy, unfiltered, immediate, and slowly, journalists, politicians, and celebrities begin to adopt it as a broadcast tool, a feedback loop, and a brand amplifier. Inside Facebook, the threat is recognized. Though Twitter's user base is far smaller, its growth curve is steep, and more importantly, its model is simpler. Mark is not impressed by the interface. He sees Twitter as unstructured, noisy, unscalable. But he understands something important. Attention is shifting, and Facebook cannot afford to lose it. In response, Facebook accelerates its efforts. It redesigns the user interface to include more real-time updates. It retools the news feed. It experiments with status, visibility, making posts feel more dynamic, more public. But all of this is happening within a larger transition, one that mirrors, on a global scale, what had already happened to Eduardo. Saverin. The company is learning to outgrow those who built it. Not out of spite, not even out of strategy, but out of something more structural. A belief that control must be preserved at all costs, even when it means reshaping relationships with people, with users, with partners. And now, Facebook is beginning to reshape another group, its developers. Back in 2007, when the Facebook platform launched, it was a gold rush. Thousands of developers built apps, games flourished, data flowed freely. But by 2008, that open-door culture begins to change. Facebook had grown wary of apps that abused data access or undermined user trust. Spammy behavior, unclear permissions, third-party tracking. And so, the company begins to tighten the rules. APIs are limited. App review processes are introduced. Developers are required to meet stricter terms. On the surface, these are smart moves intended to protect users and enforce quality. But developers begin to notice something else. Apps that compete with Facebook's own features are quietly throttled. Companies that grow too powerful within the Facebook ecosystem are limited or cut off. This pattern will repeat in future years, over and over, and the dynamic is always the same: open access, rapid growth, dependence, then restriction. The strategy is not unlike what had been used with Eduardo. Welcome the contribution, extract the value, redefine the relationship, then move forward without them. That same year, Facebook makes another major move, one that alters its public face. It hires its first Chief Operating Officer, Sheryl Sandberg. Sheryl is no stranger to high-stakes business. She had worked at the World Bank, then served as Chief of Staff to the US Treasury, and most recently was a top executive at Google, where she had built the company's ad business. Mark, though still CEO, knew what he didn't know, and he knew that scaling Facebook to a global company would require operational expertise beyond his experience. Cheryl brings that experience. She establishes processes, builds teams, and begins designing a long-term business model centered around advertising. Quietly, but unmistakably, Facebook begins its shift from platform to media company to surveillance-based ad network. As this transformation takes root, the company continues to grow. By the end of 2008, Facebook is available in over 70 languages, operating in 170 countries, and approaching 150 million users. It is no longer a place, it is a system, an identity layer for the internet, and the values that had once guided it, connection, expression, discovery, are increasingly filtered through the logic of scale, of data, and of control. There is no public mention of Eduardo Savin. His name does not appear in interviews. His story is not told to new hires. But the mechanism that removed him, silent restructuring, legal dominance, emotional detachment, is alive in every major decision. In its way, that early betrayal has become a template. The year is 2009, and Facebook is no longer simply growing. It is everywhere. The company begins the year with 150 million users, and ends it with more than 350 million. This is not just growth. It is a kind of quiet, global absorption. Each day, more people log in. More countries are connected. The rhythms of daily life, birthdays, weddings, photos, opinions, friendships, are increasingly mediated through the platform. People are now using Facebook not just to connect with friends, but to broadcast themselves. Status updates become declarations, photo albums become records. Liking something becomes a kind of soft approval, a digital nod. It's simple, frictionless, and oddly powerful. But underneath the familiar blue and white design, the company's structure is shifting, becoming more purposeful, more extractive, and more corporate. And in this transformation, we see, again, the same impulse that once removed Eduardo Savin, a belief that scale is more important than sentiment, that ownership is earned not by loyalty, but by utility, that relationships, even friendships, are conditional on contribution. Internally, Facebook's culture is now shaped by a growing divide between engineering and business. On the one hand, engineers like Andrew Bosworth, Chris Cox, and others are focused on optimizing user experience, building better feeds, faster interfaces, cleaner designs. On the other, Sheryl Sandberg is building an advertising empire. Quietly, behind the product, Facebook is assembling one of the most sophisticated advertising platforms the world has ever seen, and it begins, as always, with data. Every action on Facebook is logged. What you click, how long you pause on a photo, what kinds of pages you like, who you interact with, which devices you use, and when, what your friends do, and how you respond. This data is not simply stored. It is modeled. Patterns are analyzed, predictions are formed, and slowly a profile is built. Not the one you create with a profile picture and a status, but the one the system creates about you. Silently. And this profile becomes the product. Advertisers are no longer buying space on a wall. They are buying access to behavior. They want to reach people who are about to get engaged, people who might be depressed, people who live in a specific neighborhood, make a certain income, and like a particular television show, and Facebook can deliver that with a few clicks. To users, this shift is invisible. The interface still feels personal, familiar. The fonts are soft, the edges rounded. You see your friends, you post your thoughts, you comment on birthdays. But the design of the platform is now two-sided. On the front, human connection. On the back, predictive analytics, ad auctions, and engineered persuasion. And this new engine of monetization is remarkably effective. By the end of 2009, Facebook is generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, most of it from advertising, much of it from targeting. It is not yet as large as Google or Amazon. But it has something neither of them have: social context. And that, quietly, becomes Facebook's competitive edge. Where Google tracks queries, Facebook tracks relationships. Where Amazon tracks purchases, Facebook tracks identity. It knows how you feel, who you trust, what you share when you're not thinking too hard about it. And it begins to shape itself around those insights. The news feed becomes increasingly algorithmic, no longer a simple reverse chronological list, but a carefully ranked stream of content, chosen by relevance, likelihood of engagement, and behavioral cues. You don't see everything. You see what the system thinks you want to see. This change is subtle, gradual, and not openly announced. But it is profound, because now, Facebook is not a mirror. It is a filter. And once again, the logic that erased Eduardo Savarino seems to repeat itself, but at scale. Just as Eduardo's early contributions were eventually deemed non-essential, so too are the original expectations of users that the platform is neutral, linear, transparent. Facebook doesn't remove those features. It simply rewrites them in the background, without telling you. It smiles, it listens, and it changes the rules anyway. By the end of 2009, Facebook is facing new kinds of questions. Journalists begin to ask about privacy. Academics begin studying social behavior. Lawmakers, especially in Europe, raise concerns about data practices. But none of these challenges yet carry the weight to slow the company's ascent. Its user base has now surpassed that of MySpace, Orkut, and even Twitter. In countries across the globe, Facebook is the internet for millions of people. It is the first tab they open, the last thing they check at night, a social utility. Yes, but also a map of modern life. And at the heart of it all, Mark Zuckerberg remains in control. He rarely gives interviews. He rarely appears emotional. He speaks in the language of systems and frameworks. And when asked what drives Facebook's growth, he offers a simple answer. People want to share. But that is only part of the truth. Because people do not only share, they are also shaped. And in 2009, for the first time, we begin to understand that Facebook isn't just a place where you see your friends. It's a place where your attention, your behavior, and your trust are constantly being modeled, quietly, calmly, and with great precision. It is early 2010. The decade turns with a quiet hum. Smartphones now hum in pockets. Broadband is commonplace, and the internet has evolved from novelty to necessity. And at the center of this change is Facebook. At the beginning of the year, Facebook has roughly 400 million users. By mid-year, it passes 500 million, 500 million people, connected through profiles and posts, friendships and photos, all clicking, scrolling, reacting. Bark. Zuckerberg marks the milestone with a brief public note. Helping 500 million people connect is amazing, humbling, and by far the thing I am most proud of in my life. But behind that pride is an increasingly complex machine. The product is not just growing, it is learning. Every user interaction, a comment, a share, a message, feeds into the platform's algorithms. And these algorithms, quietly, are shaping a new digital landscape, one where visibility is earned not through importance or truth, but through engagement. And to accelerate that engagement, Facebook introduces a single iconic feature, a small blue thumbs up. The like button. The feature is rolled out gradually in February 2010. It seems almost trivial. A simple way to affirm something, to show appreciation or agreement without typing a comment. No, one needs to explain how it works. It is intuitive, almost universal, and that is exactly why it is powerful. The like button turns a feeling into a signal, and in doing so, it changes the platform's architecture in several key ways. 1. It generates data. Every like is a data point, not just on the content, but on the user who clicked it. Likes can be tracked, sorted, mapped. They reveal patterns, what topics people prefer, what pages they follow, what time they engage. 2. It influences visibility. Content with more likes begins to rise in the newsfeed. The algorithm interprets these signals as popularity, and popularity becomes the new currency. A post that receives 20 likes is now worth more than one that receives 2, regardless of context. 3. It changes behavior. People begin to write differently. They start posting what they think will get more likes. Photos become more curated. Opinions become sharper. Humor becomes punchier. Sadness becomes stylized. The platform, which once mirrored your social life, now starts to shape it, rewarding the posts that perform, and quietly hiding those that do not. Internally, Facebook engineers track this transformation. They watch the graphs curve upward. More time on site, more interactions, more data. The like button is a triumph, not because it's flashy, but because it is frictionless. 1,000 likes take less than a minute to give, and every single one teaches the algorithm something new. From this point forward, Facebook is no longer just collecting data on what users do, it is conditioning what they do. And that process, once again, echoes the dynamic that defined Eduardo Saverin's removal. Subtle shifts. No open conflict, just quiet redefinition of what matters and who matters. By mid-2010, the company's internal philosophy is adapting to this new reality. A common phrase emerges inside Facebook's product teams: what you like is what you see. This becomes the foundation for EdgeRank, Facebook's first widely known content ranking system, though never fully disclosed to the public. EdgeRank combines 3 main elements: affinity, how close you are to the person who posted, the type of interaction, likes, comments, shares, recency, how recently the post was made. With this formula, the newsfeed becomes selective. It no longer shows everything. It shows what the algorithm determines is most relevant. But relevance, in this case, is not neutral. It's emotional, it's viral, it's designed to hold attention. And so, a soft transformation begins to unfold. People stop asking, what do I want to share, and begin to wonder, what will people like? It is a shift so subtle that most never notice, but it rewires behavior all the same. Personal moments become performative, opinions become optimized. The self becomes a feed, curated, filtered, tuned, and this change is not only cultural, it is profitable, because now Facebook knows what you like, and that means it knows what you might buy, too. Under Sheryl Sandberg's leadership, Facebook's advertising business is rapidly expanding. It is no longer just banners or sidebar ads. It is sponsored content, embedded directly into the newsfeed. indistinguishable from posts, except for a small, sponsored label, and the targeting is sophisticated. Advertisers can now select their audiences based on location, age, gender, interests, device usage, relationship, status, and, critically, what users like. This level of targeting had never been possible at such scale, and it works. Advertisers flock to the platform. Small businesses use it to reach local audiences. Political campaigns use it to reach likely voters. And Facebook's revenue climbs. By the end of 2010. The company earns over $1.9 billion, with more than 95% of that from advertising. Meanwhile, the company is preparing for its next phase. It now employs over 2,000 people. It has offices in London, New York, Dublin, Tokyo, and more. And internally, the leadership begins discussing something once considered unthinkable: a public offering. An IPO. Facebook is still technically private, but the scale of its business is beginning to strain that structure. Investors want liquidity. Employees want equity to materialize. The company is approaching a threshold where growth, ambition, and accountability must converge. But Mark is cautious. He does not want to go public too soon. He knows what happens when vision becomes diluted by shareholders. He has seen it before, in other tech companies, in boardrooms that value quarterly earnings over product integrity, and more than anything, Mark wants to retain control, just as he did in 2004, when he quietly diluted Eduardo's shares, just as he did with the platform when he redesigned it without asking. Just as he does now, with a feed that shows you what he decides you should see. Control is not always loud. Sometimes it is a quiet checkbox, a silent algorithm, a button shaped like a thumb. It is early 2011, and the Facebook office is quiet, in that uniquely Silicon Valley way. Not silent, just absorbed. Rows of desks stretch across open-plan floors. Engineers in hoodies sip coffee from reusable mugs, eyes fixed on glowing monitors. Product teams huddle over mock-ups. Meeting rooms pulse with slide decks and low, flat voices. The furniture is simple. The walls bear slogans: move fast and break things. A mantra, a warning, a badge. Above all, the energy is focused, not on what Facebook is now, but what it's about to become. Because this is the year the company begins preparing to go public. The conversation had been building for months. By now, Facebook is simply too large to remain a private company much longer. Investors, employees, and financial institutions are all eyeing the eventual IPO, not if, but when. The company is estimated to be worth $50 billion, thanks in large part to secondary markets where private investors trade company shares. These valuations aren't speculative anymore. They're grounded in real numbers. Revenue is nearing $4 billion annually. Daily active users are approaching 500 million. Every hour, millions of interactions are logged, categorized, and stored. And with each of those interactions, Facebook becomes less of a company and more of a system, one that weaves itself through relationships, routines, and entire societies. But as Facebook expands, so does scrutiny, and in 2011, for the first time, that scrutiny begins to turn political. It starts far from Silicon Valley in Tunisia, then Egypt, then across the Middle East and North Africa. Protesters rise, regimes teeter. What will later be called the Arab Spring unfolds across Facebook timelines, through WhatsApp messages, on YouTube, and on Twitter feeds. But Facebook plays a particularly unique role. It provides the infrastructure for organizing, Protest events are created. Photos of brutality go viral. News uncensored and immediate is shared between friends, across cities, and around the world. In Cairo's Tahrir Square, banners appear with Facebook's logo drawn by hand, a symbol of connectivity, of speech, of rebellion. At first, Facebook says little. The company maintains its now familiar tone. It is a platform, not a participant, a neutral tool, an empty stage on which others act. But internally, executives begin to realize something that cannot be unlearned. Facebook is not just showing the world, it is now helping to shape it. At the same time, back in the United States, Facebook is restructuring its internal systems for public life. It hires more legal staff, more financial officers. It begins organizing its cap table, preparing to disclose earnings, answer to shareholders, file formal S-1 documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC). Sheryl Sandberg leads many of these efforts. Her background at Google, her connections in Washington, and her belief in the company's vision help smooth this transition from high-growth startup to global public firm. But as this process unfolds, questions emerge. How will Facebook define its mission, not just on paper, but in practice? What responsibility does it have for what it amplifies? And what will it mean for a platform originally built to rate college students, to now wield influence over political systems, media narratives, and national movements? These are not theoretical concerns, because even as Facebook prepares for its IPO, a more pressing transformation is happening in the newsfeed itself. Up until now, the algorithm that powers the newsfeed has been relatively straightforward. It prioritizes posts that generate engagement, likes, comments, shares. But engineers are beginning to see a pattern. Not all engagement is equal. Some types of content, especially those that provoke anger, outrage, or fear, drive significantly more interaction. A heartfelt photo of a child's birthday party might get 30 likes, but a politically charged post, even a misleading one, might get 300. The algorithm notices, and the algorithm adapts. It surfaces what performs. And what performs, increasingly, is conflict. This, again, mirrors the old pattern, the logic that drove Eduardo Savarin from the company all those years ago. Not a sudden decision, not a single, dramatic break, but a quiet recalibration, a shift in metrics, a change in what value means, a new system of relevance. Just as Eduardo's steady, methodical contributions were eventually dismissed in favor of faster, flashier growth, so too are calmer voices in the newsfeed pushed aside, gently, algorithmically, in favor of the content that keeps users clicking. Not necessarily what they need, but what they react to. And it works. Time on site increases. Return visits spike. Advertisers get more impressions. And Facebook's business grows stronger. But something else grows too. A sense, subtle but real, that the platform is not just showing you your world. It is shaping how you feel about it. As the IPO nears, Facebook begins preparing its S-1 filing, the formal document submitted to the SEC that outlines its financials, strategy, risks, and vision for public investors. The opening lines of the document are striking. They read, "Facebook was not originally created to be a company. It was built to accomplish a social mission, to make the world more open and connected." It is a compelling message, clean, ambitious, purposeful, but in the same document, a few lines down, a different kind of statement appears. "We expect Our advertising revenue will continue to be our primary source of income for the foreseeable future. The tension is visible. Connection on the front end, monetization on the back. A familiar structure, one that began all those years ago with two friends in a dorm room. One who saw potential, one who saw scale, and only one who would remain in control. By the end of 2011, Facebook is ready. The IPO is scheduled for early 2012, and the world is watching, not because they still remember the story of Eduardo Savaryn, most don't, but because Facebook has become something larger than any one founder, any one user, any one country. It is now a system of influence, and systems like algorithms and corporate structures rarely remember their origin stories, only their next goal. It is the morning of May 18th, 2012. At the Nasdaq market site in New York City, the digital ticker screen flashes the blue and white logo. Facebook. It's official, the company, born in a Harvard dorm room just 8 years earlier, is now a public entity, trading under the ticker symbol FB. It is one of the most highly anticipated IPOs in the history of the tech industry. Mark Zuckerberg is in attendance, wearing his usual dark grey HOODIE. He rings the virtual bell, cameras flash, reporters lean in, traders stare at their monitors. And with that, Facebook becomes a $100 billion company. But despite the pageantry, one detail quietly sets this IPO apart from nearly every other before it. Mark Zuckerberg has not given up control. In most companies, going public means diluting ownership. Founders typically give up some decision-making power in exchange for capital. Their influence becomes subject to a board of directors, investor demands, and shareholder votes. But Facebook's structure is different. Long before the IPO, Mark and his legal team, with guidance from Sheryl Sandberg, top lawyers, and veteran investors, had implemented a dual-class share structure. There are two types of shares. Class A shares, sold to the public, 1 vote per share. Class B shares, held by insiders, including Mark, each has 10 votes per share. This means that even after the IPO, even after Facebook becomes a public company, Mark retains over 55% of the voting power, more than the board, more than the public, more than all other investors combined. He can never be outvoted. He cannot be removed as CEO unless he chooses to step down. He has absolute control codified in law, institutionalized by structure, and accepted by Wall Street. This is not an accident. It is the culmination of a philosophy that began long ago, before shares, before IPOs, before lawsuits. The idea that Facebook would only survive and thrive if one person held the steering wheel, that compromise would dilute vision, that committees would slow progress, that a founder who surrendered power, like so many had before, would watch their creation morph into something unrecognizable. So Mark doesn't let go, and in this we see again the echo of Eduardo Savaryn, because this, too, is a kind of exclusion, not of one friend now, but of millions of future voices. Investors can buy stock, they can earn dividends, but they cannot steer the ship. Only Mark can do that. The IPO itself is not smooth. In the days leading up to the launch, expectations are high. Analysts believe Facebook stock will soar. But on the day of trading, technical glitches at Nasdaq delay opening trades for hours. When the stock finally begins trading, it fluctuates wildly. It opens at $38, briefly rises, then falls again. By the end of the day, Facebook's stock closes barely above its offering price. In the days that follow, it drops below the IPO price, a disappointment for many retail investors and institutions. Critics begin to ask whether Facebook is truly worth its valuation, whether it can sustain growth, whether it has a plan to monetize mobile users who now represent an increasingly large portion of its audience, but generate far less ad revenue. Inside Facebook, the reaction is quiet. There is no panic. The engineers keep building, the product teams keep testing, the leadership stays the course, because they know, in a very literal sense, that they are not accountable to outside pressure in the same way other public companies are. The control remains centralized. The structure of Facebook, like its algorithms, is designed for stability, not transparency. In the months following the IPO, Facebook intensifies its focus on monetization. Two paths emerge. Mobile ads. Until now, Facebook's mobile app has shown few, if any, ads. But now, the company begins integrating sponsored stories and native ads directly into the mobile newsfeed. These ads are made to look like regular posts, subtle, immersive, and high-performing. Data partnerships. Facebook expands its network of external data providers, allowing advertisers to combine Facebook data with other information like purchase history, email addresses, and demographic targeting. It also launches custom audiences, a tool that lets companies upload their customer email lists to Facebook and then target those users directly with ads. The effect is seamless, and users don't even know it's happening. Facebook's public identity continues to evolve. It is no longer just a website. It is a global advertising platform, a political messaging machine, a mobile app pre-installed on smartphones, a data engine that observes, predicts, and influences behavior at scale, and yet, to many users, it still feels personal. That's part of the brilliance. You don't see Facebook. You see your friends, your memories, your life, arranged, filtered, and curated just for you. But behind that simplicity is a system of profound complexity. Every action, every interaction, feeds the same central machine, and at the very top of that machine sits the person who built it, not by accident, but by design, to never be answerable to anyone else. In interviews that year, Mark speaks softly about his intentions. He talks about the company's mission. He repeats the word connection. He uses phrases like giving people the power to share and building a more open world. But these words, for all their gentleness, have come to mean something more strategic, because in the system Facebook has now created, connection is a metric, openness is an input, and sharing is not just encouraged, it is engineered. The company learns more every day, and it builds accordingly. The betrayal of Eduardo Severin is long past, but its structure, the idea that power must remain centralized, that trust is secondary to growth, is now institutionalized in Facebook's DNA. Just as Mark diluted Eduardo's shares without a word, he now builds a company that cannot be diluted by anyone else, not shareholders, not journalists, not even governments, at least, not yet. By the end of 2012, Facebook stock has recovered. Its revenue is up. Its user base has surpassed 1 billion people, and it is only just beginning. The world is now connected, whether it asks to be or not. It is early 2013, and Facebook is operating in over 100 languages, used in nearly every country on Earth. Over 1 billion people log in each month. In some regions, particularly in parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. It is the first and only social platform many users have ever encountered. The company now has over 6,000 employees, sprawling across multiple continents. From data centers in Sweden to legal teams in Washington, D.C., Mark Zuckerberg, just 29 years old, is no longer viewed as a wunderkind. He is now seen as a quiet, driven architect of a system that has no real precedent. But beneath the public milestones, revenue, user growth, international expansion, something more delicate is underway. Facebook is beginning to experiment, not in secret, exactly, but not in the way people expect either. The logic of optimization. Facebook's product teams talk about the newsfeed, the way one might discuss a living organism. It must be fed, it must adapt, it must be tuned, not once, but constantly. Every tweak to the feed, the placement of a photo, the prominence of a story, the ranking of a comment, affects how users behave. More likes, more shares, longer sessions. The question facing Facebook's leadership is no longer whether they influence user behavior. That's accepted. The question now is how deeply that influence can reach. And in January 2012, though the world won't learn of it until 2014, a new kind of test begins. An experiment that crosses a boundary, subtle, unseen, into the realm of emotion. The emotional contagion study, officially it is called, experimental evidence of massive-scale emotional contagion through social networks. Internally, it is simply known as the mood experiment, conducted in collaboration with researchers from Cornell University and the University of California, San Francisco. The experiment quietly alters the news feeds of nearly 700,000 users. Half the users see a feed slightly more weighted toward positive posts, status updates with happy words, upbeat content, celebrations. The other half sees more negative posts, complaints, sad news, frustration. The goal: to determine whether exposure to emotion-laden content affects users' own emotional expressions. The answer is yes. The data shows a measurable shift in the language users post after being shown a certain kind of feed. More negative content seen equals more negative content written. More positivity seen equals more positive updates posted. Emotion, it turns out, is contagious, even when mediated through an algorithm. The reaction, once the study is made public in mid-2014, is swift and sharp. Critics call it manipulative. Ask whether such research conducted without informed consent should ever be allowed on this scale. News outlets run headlines like, "Facebook messed with your mind." The Facebook experiment, manipulating emotions for science, is Facebook playing God. The company responds with a blog post, not an apology. They argue that the study was minimal, that no names were involved, that user behavior was only slightly influenced, and that these kinds of tests are essential for improving the product. They remind the public that Facebook's terms of service, long and unread, do allow for research and testing, but the damage is done. A new awareness begins to spread, that Facebook isn't just observing behavior, it is actively shaping it, and it has been for years. The line that isn't drawn there is no legal penalty, no regulators step in. Users, by and large, don't leave the platform, but something important has shifted. Until now, Facebook has always claimed neutrality, that it simply reflects what users do. But the mood experiment demonstrates a more complex reality, because when a platform controls the feed, it controls experience. And when it controls experience, it begins to affect emotion. And when it can affect emotion, it begins to influence decisions. Not always directly, not always predictably, but undeniably, and that influence is not disclosed, not labeled, not chosen. It just happens quietly, like everything Facebook does. The legacy of power in all this. There is a shadow, familiar, subtle, but unmistakable. It is the same logic that drove Eduardo Saverin out of the company. Influence is earned by usefulness. Trust is not a permanent feature. Control is too important to share. The mood experiment is not a mistake. It is a natural continuation of Facebook's guiding philosophy. Test everything. Optimize always. Ask for forgiveness later, if at all. Too many inside the company. This approach makes perfect sense. It produces results. It drives growth. It's effective. But outside the company, users are beginning to feel something else. A sense of discomfort. A sense that the thing they thought they were using is actually using them. And not just for ads, but to study them, to guide them, to change them. A calm face through it all. Facebook's external voice remains soft in public appearances. Mark Zuckerberg is composed, restrained. He speaks about openness, mission, connectivity. He does not talk about behavioral science. He does not talk about control. When asked about the experiment, he deflects, pointing toward product improvements, user satisfaction, innovation. But in private meetings, behind closed doors, the data speaks louder. The platform can change behavior. It can influence mood. It can shape perception. And no one else in the world, not governments, not news outlets, not schools, has this kind of access to people's daily psychological lives. It is an extraordinary kind of power, and no one voted for it. By the end of 2014, Facebook has passed 1.3 billion users. It owns Instagram now, purchased in 2012 for $1 billion, a bargain. In hindsight, it is working on new tools, facial recognition, internet delivery systems, and new forms of machine learning. It is building a future, one experiment at a time. And the world is still clicking like it is early 2015. By now, Facebook is not merely a website or even a platform. It is the infrastructure for a large portion of the public internet, with over 1.4 billion active users. It is used by presidents, teenagers, journalists, farmers, soldiers, artists, and scammers. For many, it is the first app they open in the morning, the last they check before bed, the place where life happens, and increasingly, the place where news happens. The death of the homepage over the past 5 years. The world's major newspapers and media organizations had adapted themselves to the digital world. At first, they leaned on their own homepages, tightly curated, editorially controlled. But over time, they began noticing a pattern. Fewer people were visiting their websites directly. More were encountering stories via Facebook. A headline shared by a friend. A news story liked by a relative. A video pushed to the top of the newsfeed by the algorithm. Traffic followed these links. And with that traffic, power shifted. Media outlets now depended on Facebook, not only for distribution, but for survival. This was not an accident. Facebook had introduced instant articles, a feature that allowed news publishers to post directly within Facebook's ecosystem, eliminating loading times and increasing engagement. It was framed as a benefit. Faster pages, better experience. But the terms were implicit. To reach your audience, you must play by our rules. To grow, you must stay in the feed. To stay in the feed, You must feed the algorithm. And the algorithm, of course, rewarded what it always had: emotion, engagement, and volume. In short, outrage traveled better than nuance. Facebook didn't make this true, but it amplified it. And in 2015, that amplification would begin to have consequences far beyond product updates or media strategies. It would begin to reshape politics. In the United States, the presidential race is beginning. Candidates from both major parties are announcing their campaigns. Traditional outlets cover their speeches, track polls, analyze policy. But Facebook sees something else: an explosion of content, memes, videos, comments, live streams. Entire campaign events are now being hosted, shared, and reacted to on Facebook in real time. The campaign of Donald Trump, in particular, leans into this dynamic. His statements, controversial, confrontational, often unfiltered, travel well in the algorithmic environment. They provoke, they divide, they engage, and so they rise. Not because Facebook supports them politically. The platform insists it is neutral, but because the system simply favors reaction, and Trump's campaign understands that system better than most. Behind the scenes, his team runs thousands of targeted Facebook ads, micro-campaigns designed for specific demographics, using Facebook's tools to test, learn, and iterate. The company is aware of this activity. It enables it. It profits from it, but it does not yet question it. Because to Facebook, all engagement is good engagement, and the campaign is generating plenty. Around this same time, something else begins to take hold, slowly, then suddenly. A new category of content, not opinion, not satire, but outright falsehood. Headlines that scream, Pope endorses Trump, Obama bans Pledge of Allegiance, Hillary Clinton running child trafficking ring from pizza shop. These stories, often coming from obscure websites or overseas operations, begin spreading rapidly across Facebook. They are not flagged. They are not slowed. In fact, they often outperform legitimate journalism, not despite their falsehood, but because of it. They confirm what certain readers already want to believe, and Facebook, tuned to reward whatever gets the most engagement, rewards them accordingly. These articles are clicked, shared, reacted to, reinforced by the platform's logic. And that logic, once again, mirrors the structure that removed Eduardo Severin so long ago. The system does not ask, is it right? It only asks, does it work? And if it works, if it drives growth, it is kept. Inside Facebook, not everyone is comfortable with these trends. Some data scientists raise concerns. Some policy staff suggest content review protocols. Engineers begin flagging unusual traffic patterns from countries like Russia, Macedonia, and Serbia, where entire news farms are being built to produce profitable disinformation. But structurally, there is no incentive to stop it. Content moderation is expensive, misinformation is profitable, and user engagement, the heartbeat of the business, continues to climb. Mark Zuckerberg, when asked about fake news in November 2016, responds, "I think the idea that fake news on Facebook influenced the election in any way is a pretty crazy idea. It is a measured statement, distant, but soon. That distance will shrink, because, in November 2016, Donald Trump is elected President of the United States, and suddenly, Facebook is no longer just a stage, it is part of the act. In the days and weeks that follow the election, the scrutiny intensifies. Journalists dig into data patterns. Researchers publish early analyses. Reports emerge of Russian disinformation campaigns, using Facebook pages and ads to sow division, discourage voting, and amplify tension. The Internet Research Agency, a Russian operation based in St. Petersburg, is identified as a major source of political content, much of it inflammatory, often false. They had created fake pages with names like Blacktivist and Heart of Texas, bought targeted ads using Facebook's ad platform reach. Millions of users, many in swing states, saw this, using Facebook's tools, and none of it was detected until after the election. Not because Facebook couldn't detect it, but because it wasn't looking. It was optimizing once again. The structure of the company reveals its core. Allow entry, observe, behavior reward. What performs quietly, change the rules only if necessary, just as Eduardo Saverin's shares were reduced without a meeting, without a warning, and only after he had already been pushed aside. So too were safeguards around political content ignored until after the effects had materialized. And when Facebook does respond, it is with soft language. They promise to do better, to invest in trust and safety, to collaborate with experts, but never to accept that the platform's fundamental architecture, its preference for engagement over context, is what makes this behavior inevitable, because to do that would mean admitting that the platform is not neutral, that it is not simply a tool, that it is a force. By the end of 2016, Facebook is under investigation in multiple countries. Congress wants answers. Europe begins drafting legislation. Advertisers start to ask questions. But the company remains steady. Mark remains in control, and the world continues to scroll. Every action still observed. Every click still stored. Every reaction still fed into the same great machine. By the middle of Facebook's second decade, the distance between its origin and its present had become vast. What began in a dorm room, a hastily assembled website with a $1,000 investment and a friend's quiet faith, had become a global apparatus shaping the behavior of nearly 2 billion people. And yet, in many ways, the original structure remained intact. The decisions were still made from the top down. The feedback loops still favored speed over reflection. And the person with the final say was still Mark Zuckerberg. In the months following the 2016 US presidential election, scrutiny began to intensify. News organizations were piecing together reports of foreign interference, suspicious accounts, and fabricated stories that had circulated widely on Facebook during the campaign season. The company, for its part, deflected responsibility. The system, it said, was neutral. The users decided what to share. The platform simply served their preferences. Behind the scenes, however, the conversation was different. Internal teams had already discovered the extent of coordinated disinformation efforts originating from abroad, including a network tied to the Russian Internet Research Agency. These operations had purchased political ads, built fake activist pages, and reached millions of Americans, not through hacking or high-level breaches, but through the very tools Facebook had designed to empower its advertisers. Executives debated how much to reveal. Engineers examined ad data and flagged unusual activity, but leadership hesitated to make strong public admissions. To acknowledge the depth of manipulation would be to admit something more fundamental, that Facebook had not merely connected the world, but had structured it, subtly guiding what people saw, how they felt, and what they believed, without ever appearing to take a side. As criticism mounted, Zuckerberg quietly launched what he described as a personal challenge: to visit people in every US state, to listen and learn. The optics were simple and friendly. Here was the young founder, now in his early 30s, sitting in rural diners, attending church services, smiling in front of silos and small-town libraries. To the public, it looked like outreach. To those watching closely, it looked more like preparation. Congress was beginning to ask questions. Regulators in Europe were drafting new privacy laws, and former employees had started to speak more freely about the inner workings of a company that, for years, had operated with minimal oversight. The world was beginning to glimpse what had long been hidden behind Facebook's blue and white interface. A system that rewarded engagement without fully considering its consequences. And then, in March of 2018, something broke the surface. The Guardian and the New York Times published a joint investigation into a political consulting firm called Cambridge Analytica. The story centered around data specifically, the personal data of tens of millions of Facebook users collected, without their knowledge, through a seemingly harmless personality quiz. The quiz, developed by a researcher named Alexander Kogan, used Facebook's now outdated Graph API to not only harvest information from users who took the survey, but from all of their friends as well. This was not a breach in the traditional sense. It was a consequence of Facebook's design. At the time, such access was not only permitted, it was encouraged. Kogan sold the data to Cambridge Analytica, a firm with deep ties to conservative political operatives and wealthy donors. The company used the information to build psychological profiles of American voters, designing targeted messages meant to influence behavior and sway opinions in the 2016 election cycle. Those tools were deployed widely, with Facebook's own ad platform acting as the delivery system. Facebook had known about the data transfer for some time. In fact, internal teams had asked Kogan and Cambridge Analytica to certify that the data had been deleted as early as 2015, but they had never followed up to confirm compliance. There had been no audit, no enforcement, no user notification. When the story broke in 2018, it was not simply a revelation of improper data use. It was a revelation of indifference, a system that had never been designed to protect users in the first place. The backlash was immediate. Politicians demanded hearings. Activists called for investigations. Users began deleting their accounts in protest. For the first time, Facebook was treated not as a product, but as a power, a force, whose influence could no longer be dismissed as incidental. Zuckerberg appeared before Congress that spring. He sat at a small table in a vast hearing room, answering questions from lawmakers, many of whom struggled to understand the basic structure of the platform. He remained composed, occasionally smiling, often repeating prepared phrases. Yes, mistakes had been made. Yes, changes would be implemented. Yes, users deserved transparency. But beneath the language of apology, one fact remained unchanged. Facebook's control structure was still intact. No executive would be removed. No board member overruled. No meaningful loss of authority occurred. The architecture that had pushed Eduardo Saverin out of the company more than a decade earlier, cleanly, legally, without warning, had scaled. It now applied not just to one co-founder, but to billions of people. Information flowed into the system freely. Control remained tightly held, and accountability only arrived after exposure. Never before, Facebook responded to the Cambridge Analytica scandal by tightening third-party access, introducing new privacy tools, and offering public assurances. But these actions came late, not as safeguards, but as consequences. The culture that had long prized movement over caution, scale over subtlety, had simply followed its own logic to its inevitable conclusion. users began to understand what had been true all along, that their profiles, their preferences, their emotional patterns, all of it had been quietly recorded, analyzed, and offered to those willing to pay for the right message, at the right moment, in the right feed, and yet few left, most stayed. Because by now, Facebook was no longer just a website. It was a habit, a rhythm, a part of daily life. It had become too big, too embedded, too convenient to remove. Even in anger, people posted about Facebook on Facebook. The system held. Not because it was trusted, but because it had become necessary. And so the story continued, not with a fall, but with a shrug, not with an end, but with a new stage of adaptation. The betrayal of Eduardo had long since faded from the public mind, but the pattern he embodied remained, a slow, quiet exclusion carried out without confrontation, justified by efficiency, and sealed by structure. Facebook had learned early that it could act first and explain later, and by 2018 it had simply scaled that lesson to the size of the world. As 2019 unfolded, the tension between Facebook's outward posture and its inward machinery became harder to ignore. The platform had always maintained a position of neutrality, a system designed to reflect, not shape, to connect, not steer. But by now, the consequences of that position were beginning to show on every front. Political leaders, regulators, and civil society groups were no longer content with reassurances. They wanted transparency, they wanted accountability, and they wanted a clearer answer to a question Facebook had long avoided. Was the company simply a platform, or had it become a publisher? Inside the company, this question took on a more specific form. Should Facebook remove false or misleading political content? Should it fact-check world leaders? Should it intervene in posts that might provoke real-world harm? Mark Zuckerberg remained cautious. He continued to emphasize the platform's commitment to free expression, framing it not just as a principle, but as a duty. In speeches at Georgetown and elsewhere, he invoked the founding values of American democracy, the marketplace of ideas, the value of dissent, the fear of censorship. Facebook, he said, was not the arbiter of truth. Its role was to provide a space for open debate, but, for many, that answer was no longer sufficient, not because the principle was wrong, but because the system was no longer neutral in practice. On Facebook, content wasn't distributed evenly. It was sorted, prioritized, and magnified by algorithms optimized for engagement. That meant posts that provoked outrage, stoked identity, or stirred fear often spread faster than those that informed or explained. This was not a flaw. It was a feature inherited from a founding design that favored growth above all else, and so the very architecture of Facebook was now in question, not because it had changed, but because the world had. In the spring of 2019, a mass shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand, brought this tension into sharper focus. The attacker live-streamed the killing of 51 people on Facebook. The video spread rapidly before moderators could remove it. Copies were downloaded, re-uploaded, and shared across platforms. The event was horrifying, not only in its violence, but in how it had been broadcast and magnified using the very tools that had once been designed for sharing birthday parties and school events. Governments responded with new urgency. The Christchurch call, led by New Zealand's Prime Minister and supported by multiple world leaders, demanded that platforms take stronger steps to prevent extremist content from spreading online. Facebook pledged cooperation. But again, the underlying system remained largely the same. Later that year, Another choice reignited the same debate. The decision to exempt political ads from fact-checking. While other platforms like Twitter began limiting or banning political advertising entirely, Facebook doubled down on its open policy. Candidates could say what they liked, even falsehoods, and Facebook would carry the message unfiltered. To critics, this was reckless. To Zuckerberg, it was principled. But the deeper truth was simpler. Political ads were profitable, and their removal would have signaled a level of editorial judgment the company still sought to avoid. Even within Facebook, dissent began to grow. Leaked emails, internal protests, and open letters from employees showed a workforce increasingly divided. Some believed in the company's mission. Others saw a company paralyzed by fear of offending power, or worse, comfortable with influence as long as it remained profitable. This internal dissonance continued into 2020, a year that would test the company in ways it had never experienced before. As winter turned to spring, a new virus began spreading around the world. At first, the conversation was scattered, isolated headlines, distant numbers, but by March, it had become clear. The world was entering a global pandemic almost overnight. Facebook became even more central to daily life. With offices closed, schools remote, and in-person gatherings suspended, people turned to screens and to Facebook to stay connected. Usage surged. Video calls through Messenger and WhatsApp doubled. News feeds became lifelines. Group pages filled with neighborhood updates, mutual aid offers, and advice. But the virus brought something else, too. An avalanche of misinformation, false cures, conspiracy theories, misleading health advice, claims that the virus was man-made, or a hoax, or being used to control the population. And once again, Facebook's system amplified whatever traveled fastest, regardless of accuracy. This time, the stakes were immediate. Misinformation didn't just affect opinion. It affected behavior, whether someone wore a mask, got a vaccine, or trusted a hospital could now be influenced by what they saw in a feed. The company began partnering with the World Health Organization and local governments to surface authoritative information. It removed posts that promoted dangerous cures or denied the existence of the virus. It added fact-checking labels. It launched COVID-19 information centers and redirected searches toward verified sources. But even these steps were cautious. Facebook walked a narrow line, trying to preserve the appearance of neutrality while also responding to undeniable harm. And once again, the pace of change was reactive, not proactive. Warnings were added after damage had already been done. Policies were updated after patterns had emerged. Enforcement lagged behind intent. In the background, Facebook's structure, its systems, its incentives, its governance remained essentially the same. The company still rewarded content that kept users scrolling, still prioritized engagement as the core metric, still held centralized control in the hands of one man, and that man still believed, as he had from the beginning, that the platform could remain open while also being responsible, even as evidence suggested that openness, unmoderated, had consequences. By the end of 2020, Facebook was bigger than ever. Its user base had passed 2.7 billion monthly active users. Its revenue continued to rise. It was a core infrastructure not only for social interaction, but for politics, commerce, education, and crisis response. And yet, in its quiet way, it remained the same company that had removed a co-founder when he became inconvenient. The same company that had experimented with emotion before it asked permission. The same company that had watched false stories go viral and shrugged until the numbers became headlines. The betrayal of Eduardo Saverin had happened quietly, behind legal filings and office doors. But its logic, move fast, maintain control, explain later, had never left. Now that logic had scaled, and the world was beginning to feel the weight of what had been built in the first months of 2021. The world remained in a state of cautious transition. Vaccines were beginning to roll out. Restrictions were slowly easing, but the social, political, and informational landscape had changed in ways that would not quickly reset. Facebook remained at the center of it all. 2 billion people still opened the app each month. The company's influence stretched across elections, health behaviors, business operations, and public sentiment, yet its reputation had never been so fragile. The memory of the Cambridge Analytica scandal had not faded. Misinformation about COVID-19 and vaccines still surged through its systems, and employees, journalists, and lawmakers were asking a deeper question than ever before. What kind of company is this, really? The answer came, in part, from within. In the fall of 2021, a former Facebook product manager named Frances Haugen stepped into the spotlight. She had quietly leaked thousands of internal documents to the Wall Street Journal and to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, painting a portrait not of malicious intent, but of deliberate neglect. The documents, later dubbed the Facebook Papers, revealed that the company had conducted extensive internal research into how its platforms affected users, including teenage mental health, political polarization, and societal division. The research often confirmed what critics had long suspected, that Facebook's systems amplified harmful content, that engagement-based algorithms tended to reward outrage and division, and that certain policies were selectively enforced depending on user status or geographic region. One internal study showed that Instagram, owned by Facebook, contributed to worsening body image issues in teenage girls. Another concluded that Facebook's own design choices were contributing to rising political extremism, especially in non-English speaking countries where moderation resources were limited or entirely absent. But most damaging was not the research itself, it was what came after. Because time and again, the reports were acknowledged, discussed, and shelved. In some cases, minor changes were proposed, but rarely were core systems altered. Rarely were the trade-offs accepted, and rarely was the public informed. When Haugen testified before the U.S. Senate, she spoke calmly and directly. Facebook knows how to make its platforms safer, she said, but they won't make the necessary changes because they have put their astronomical profits before people. The words resonated, not because they were shocking, but because they felt familiar. They echoed an old and persistent pattern. Recognized the issue, acknowledge the risk, protect the system. Mark Zuckerberg, when he responded, rejected Haugen's claims. He suggested that the company cared deeply, that it worked hard to balance competing values, and that the press had misrepresented the documents. But the public mood was shifting. Each new revelation chipped away at the image of the curious Harvard student who had once just wanted to build a better online directory. That image no longer fit, and so, only weeks after Haugen's testimony, a remarkable announcement came. Facebook was changing its name. It would now be called Meta. The timing was no coincidence. The rebrand served several purposes at once. It was an attempt to distance the company from a decade of scandals, a signal of ambition beyond social media, and perhaps, most importantly, a declaration that the future lay elsewhere. Meta, Zuckerberg explained, would focus on building the metaverse, an immersive digital world of avatars, shared spaces, and persistent virtual environments. The idea was not new. Versions of it had been imagined in science fiction for decades, but Facebook's announcement gave it sudden visibility. In a highly produced video, Zuckerberg appeared inside a stylized virtual space. He spoke of presence, creativity, freedom. He described a world where people could teleport into work meetings, attend concerts, and design their surroundings with code. A world unbounded by screens, a world not just connected, but inhabited. It was a sweeping vision, and it left many people confused. Was this a distraction, a pivot, a genuine bet on the next generation of computing? Internally, the company was reorganized. Thousands of employees were reassigned to metaverse-related teams. Billions of dollars were pledged toward research and development. New hardware, like the Quest headset, was pushed more aggressively. Meta Reality Labs became a centerpiece of the company's future. But for most users, the core experience hadn't changed. Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp still functioned as they always had, feeding updates, likes, stories, ads. The name was different, but the foundation remained intact. The rebranding echoed something from long ago, back in 2005, when Facebook first incorporated as the Facebook Inc., Eduardo Severin was still officially its chief financial officer, but within a few short months, he would be removed, his shares diluted, his access revoked, his title erased. The change was legal, strategic, quiet, but the company that remained was, at its core, the same. Only the name had evolved. Now, nearly 2 decades later, that same model reappeared at scale. Rebrand, reframe, reposition, but never truly rebuild. Critics noted that while Meta talked about the future, it had not fully addressed the present. Harms continued. Misinformation persisted, content moderation lagged, and users, increasingly fatigued, began to trust the platform less, even as they continued to use it. The logic of Facebook, now Meta, had not been erased, it had merely been extended into a new domain. The metaverse, after all, was another kind of feed, a new interface, a new structure of interaction, but still guided by the same principles. Maximize engagement, collect data, shape behavior, maintain control. And just as before, the changes were explained after the systems had already been built. By the end of 2022, Meta's metaverse investments had cost the company over $10 billion, with little revenue in return. User numbers plateaued, employee morale fluctuated, and yet the commitment remained. Zuckerberg spoke of long timelines, 5 years, 10. The future would come slowly, but certainly. Outside the company, questions persisted about privacy, about influence, about the wisdom of chasing a virtual future when the real one still felt so unstable. But inside, the rhythm held steady. For Facebook's founder, the goal was no longer just to connect the world, it was to contain it, to build the environment in which connection itself would occur, and to own the architecture beneath it. And, once again, the system moved forward, unapologetic, uninterrupted, unchecked. The metaverse was supposed to be the future, at least. That had been the message. In 2021, Meta's sweeping rebrand signaled a transformation from social media company to spatial computing pioneer. The vision was immersive, animated, filled with possibilities, but by early 2023, the future had become expensive, uncertain, and more worryingly, for investors, unpopular. Horizon Worlds, the company's flagship virtual reality platform, remained sparsely populated. Users who visited found barren digital rooms, glitchy avatars, and a quiet lack of purpose. Many signed in once, then never returned. Despite billions invested, the experience never quite matched the promise. It lacked gravity, relevance, necessity. Inside Meta's offices, morale had begun to crack. Entire teams were reorganized, budgets were revised, and in March of 2023, the company announced another round of layoffs, one of the largest in its history. More than 10,000 employees were let go, following an earlier cut of 11,000 just months before. The public statement framed it as efficiency, a course correction, a leaner organization for a more disciplined future. But beneath the words, the message was clear. The company had moved too quickly, again, and was now stepping back, quietly, with minimal acknowledgement. It was a rhythm, well practiced, pull forward with bold vision, build fast, spend freely, then adjust, not through reflection, but through subtraction. And in the vacuum left behind, another frontier rose to take the spotlight. That frontier was AI chatbots, image generation, language models, predictive systems. In 2023, the tech world realigned around artificial intelligence. Companies like OpenAI and Google led the charge, releasing systems capable of writing, translating, coding, composing. The conversation shifted almost overnight, and Meta, as always, adjusted. It had been building AI systems for years, for moderation, for translation, for infrastructure. But now, the company accelerated its focus. Internally, Meta's AI division expanded rapidly. Externally, it launched Llama large language model, Meta AI, a foundational model intended to compete with the best in the field. In public statements, Mark Zuckerberg emphasized openness. Meta would open source its models, he said. It would share research, invite collaboration, avoid closed systems. This, he argued, was for the public good. A transparent AI ecosystem, accessible to developers, researchers, and ordinary users. But there was another pattern at work, one that mirrored Facebook's earliest years. By making its models freely available, Meta could shape the direction of the entire field, not by owning it, but by seeding it. Developers would build on its tools, startups would depend on its infrastructure, and quietly, the ecosystem would bend around its choices. This was the same logic that once applied to Facebook's login button, adopted freely by websites across the internet, until entire services depended on it. With AI, the architecture was more complex, but the strategy was familiar. Shape the rails, then set the train in motion. As the AI push accelerated, the metaverse remained in the background, not dead, but paused, reframed, quietly repositioned for a longer arc. Hardware development continued. The Reality Labs division remained staffed, but public messaging had softened. Now, Meta was a company building infrastructure for the future of intelligence, a vague but expansive mission, broad enough to absorb shifting trends. Still, none of this happened in a vacuum. Outside the company, regulators moved, more slowly, but with more resolve. In Europe, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act signaled a new era of tech governance. In the US, lawmakers introduced bills targeting algorithmic transparency, data privacy, and platform liability. Most failed to pass. Some lingered. A few advanced. Meta, consistent with its past, adopted a posture of cautious cooperation. It supported smart regulation, It held meetings, offered testimony, engaged with oversight bodies, but always on its terms, and always just fast enough to remain at the table. Behind the scenes, engineers still built quietly, researchers still tested models, growth teams still optimized metrics, and even as external pressures grew, the core remained unchanged. The content recommendation engine still functioned much as it had for years, maximizing attention, subtly shaping information flows, rewarding the behaviors that made users return. The business model built on advertising, on data, on engagement, still held, profits returned, markets steadied, and the systems designed long ago, designed without Eduardo Severin, designed for speed and control, continued to hum. In the background, Severin, now living in Singapore, remained a billionaire. The settlement had made him rich, even if the betrayal had removed him. He was never reabsorbed into the narrative, never brought back into the fold. His erasure had been permanent, clean, and profitable, and the company he once helped fund had never looked back. That original pattern, that original decision, had simply repeated itself again and again, in markets, in elections, in crises, in product shifts. Each time, the message was the same. Act first, maintain ownership, control the story, or reframe it entirely. By the close of 2023, Meta had weathered more public storms than most companies could survive. It had outlasted its critics, absorbed its scandals, and remained central to billions of lives. But the question had subtly changed. It was no longer, what will Meta do next? It had become, how long can a system like this keep working? And what happens when it no longer can? There were no dramatic answers, no collapse, just a slow, steady movement forward, the way it always had. By the final months of 2023, Meta had entered a new kind of stability. Not the stability of arrival, or completion, or consensus, but the stability of structure. Everything was now too large to change quickly. The metaverse investments continued, but cautiously. The AI systems expanded, but with layers of oversight. The platforms, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp still drew billions of users, quietly updating, feeding, responding. The press, once breathless with each revelation, had slowed its coverage. Users no longer expected transparency. Lawmakers, while still active, spoke less often of regulation in sweeping terms. Even many critics had softened their tone, not because their concerns had been resolved, but because the architecture of Meta now felt enduring, almost infrastructural. And in a way, it was. What began as a college experiment now functioned like a global utility. Facebook was still deeply embedded in local economies, small businesses, rural governments, and civil society organizations, not just as a social network, but as a kind of public square with private rules. Each platform within the company had its own rhythm. WhatsApp served as a lifeline for communication in much of the global south. Instagram, more curated, more aspirational, shaped the aesthetics of influence. Facebook proper remained a hub of community groups, marketplace transactions, event planning, and, increasingly, political discussion, often tinged with misinformation, resentment, or a sense of collective fatigue. But the system persisted because there were no viable alternatives that offered the same breadth, the same reach, the same decades of social context layered into the feed. Meta's business model remained largely unchanged. Targeted advertising, behavioral data, optimized delivery, the promise of personalization, a feed that knows you, adjusts to you, learns from you. Underneath it all, the same engine that once decided whose profile photo appeared in a dorm room ranking now determined which story you saw first, which ad followed it, and which voice echoed loudest in your online life. The logic had not evolved, it had simply scaled. In early 2024, Meta continued to release new AI tools, writing assistants, translation models, recommendation engines, content filters. Each was introduced as a step toward helpfulness, creativity, safety, but each also quietly deepened the platform's reach. AI now filtered what you saw, corrected your spelling, predicted your questions, shaped your conversations. The machine didn't just observe anymore, it participated. Moderation, always difficult, grew more complex. Political violence flared in parts of the world where Meta had limited regional expertise. Languages with few native-speaking moderators still suffered from delayed enforcement. In several countries, authoritarian governments used Meta's reach to suppress dissent or push coordinated propaganda, not through hacking, but through the platform's regular functions: paid ads, influencer posts, algorithmic reach. The company responded, as it always had, with statements, delayed enforcement, sometimes improved systems, but never systemic change. Because to fundamentally alter the structure would be to question the very thing that had made Facebook dominant: the ability to scale decisions through code, without needing to weigh each consequence individually. Within Meta, leadership remained remarkably stable. Mark Zuckerberg continued as CEO. Sheryl Sandberg, though no longer coup, was still involved from a distance. New executives arrived, rebranded, reshuffled, but the core remained, a founder-led company with unified control. Decisions could be made quickly, but rarely were they reversed. Shareholders stayed loyal, profits recovered, the stock performed. Wall Street, once skeptical of the metaverse, turned its attention back to AI, where Meta was again seen as a serious, possibly dominant player. And amid it all, one story quietly faded into myth: the story of Eduardo Saverin. He was no longer mentioned in interviews, rarely quoted, occasionally cited as a co-founder, mostly as a footnote. The betrayal that had shaped the early legal and emotional architecture of Facebook had become part of its quiet DNA, absorbed into policy, normalized through scale. Saverin had been the first to be pushed out, the first to realize that friendship and business did not mix in a system built for unilateral control. But he had not been the last. His removal was not a personal act, it was structural, and that structure had outlived its founders, its scandals, and most of its scrutiny. By 2024, that pattern governed far more than an equity agreement. It governed speech, memory, attention, even reality in its quiet way. Facebook, now Meta, had created not just a company, but a framework for human interaction at scale, a framework that few understood completely, one that was difficult to regulate, impossible to replace, and deeply shaped by the values of a single person in a single dorm room. A very long time ago, he had built something remarkable, and when the time came, he had removed the only person who might have complicated his vision, not out of rage or even conflict, but out of method, out of design. That was the real betrayal, not the emotion, but the efficiency. It began with two college students, one with an idea, the other with a checkbook, one with the code, the other with the trust. They shared pizza in dorm rooms, sent emails back and forth, registered a domain. They wanted something simple: to build a way for people to see each other better, to find one another in the blur of campus life There were no lawyers then, no publicists, just the soft illusion of equality that often comes with youth before contracts are signed, before stakes are understood. And then, in the smallest of shifts, that balance tipped. One held the reins, the other funded the ride. And when the system needed structure, when investors circled and stakes became numbers, one was essential and the other was optional. That was the shape of it. That's always been the shape of it. The removal of Eduardo Saverin was not framed as cruelty. It was not cast in anger. It was executed with precision, through paperwork, through silence, through formal language. His title was removed, his stake diluted, his signature left behind in early filings, while his influence was quietly erased. And the company that emerged, Facebook, then Meta, would come to mirror that first choice in all its systems. Decisions would be made internally. Power would remain centralized. Correction would come only after exposure, and even then, cautiously. The platform would be given freely to the world. With open hands and quiet rules, people would post and scroll and react, believing themselves in control. But they were not designing the rails, they were simply riding them, and over time, the world adjusted. Governments debated, parents worried, critics wrote, but the machine never stopped. It slowed, it shifted, it optimized, but it did not stop, because it had been built not just to function but to protect itself. Eduardo was the first to see that. He saw it in contracts, in delays, in the final moment when he arrived in Palo Alto, only to find that he was no longer included in the future he helped fund. His betrayal was not explosive, it was procedural. He sued, he settled, he faded from view, and the company kept moving. That same logic, clean, precise, efficient, now governs information at planetary scale. It decides what is seen, what is ignored, what is rewarded. The system that removed a friend now filters the world, not because of malice, not even because of ambition, but because of design. So when we think of Facebook or Meta, we are not just thinking of a company, we are thinking of an idea that began with trust and chose structure instead. We are thinking of a machine built in the image of one man's instinct to retain control, to act first, and to build something that would never need to ask permission again. And we are thinking, perhaps, of the cost of that instinct, not in dollars, but in something quieter, in friendships ended, in systems unshared, in platforms that no longer remember the names of the people who first believed in them. There is no great moral here, no final judgment, just a shape, a company that grew from a dorm room, that reshaped human connection, that rewrote the rules of trust at scale. And at the center, a simple story, one that began with two friends and ended with only one.